Hey guys, welcome back. We're going to jump right into the last little bit of notes on Unit 2, which is all about federalism. We left off with the idea of dual federalism. And if you remember, this is where each of the governments, the federal governments and the states, each have their own spheres, their own areas of responsibility. And within each sphere, the states and the federal government are supreme. They rule their own areas. And we call that dual federalism at the same time, going at the same time. And this idea of dual federalism, where the federal government had responsibilities and the states had responsibilities, that worked okay until we had the Industrial Revolution. And that's going to bring about a lot of changes. And so, with the Industrial Revolution, Congress used the Commerce Clause that, if you look it up in the handy dandy pocket Constitution, it says Congress has the right to regulate trade among the states. So, interstate commerce. And they use that a lot in order to justify their actions. The Progressive Era, which started in the early 1900s, brought in a variety of legislation, including the amendments, 16th Amendment income tax, 17th Amendment direct election of U.S. senators. But we also have laws like the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. And you have to ask yourself, where in the Constitution does it say the federal government has the right to regulate what goes in medicine? And it's like nowhere in the Constitution does it say that. But Congress said, well, people make medicine, it's transported across state lines, that's interstate commerce, it's our right to regulate it. The Meat Inspection Act, where in the Constitution does it say the federal government has the power to inspect, for health reasons, meatpacking facilities? Well, they said, well, that meat can be transported across state lines and sold, so that's interstate commerce. We have the right to regulate it. The Constitution, as I said, doesn't or never gave Congress the explicit power to regulate safety and health, and even the idea of morals with the idea of prohibition. And so they used the Commerce Clause to justify these actions. Even laws, federal laws such as the Automobile Theft Act, laws dealing with drug dealers, bank robberies, all of these use the Commerce Clause to justify, I've said that a lot of times already, to justify the Congress's actions. In the early 19 teens, in the 20s, the Supreme Court held back some of these progressive movements. There's a court case, Hammer versus Dagenhart, and the Supreme Court overruled or declared unconstitutional a child labor law because the Supreme Court said child labor has nothing to do with interstate commerce. It has to do with manufacturing inside a factory within a state. And so that's not Congress's prerogative. That's not within Congress's jurisdiction. But in the 1920s, they said, you know what, manufacturing inside a factory in one specific state is related to interstate commerce, and so Congress has the right to regulate it. During the New Deal programs of FDR, most programs were declared constitutional. Some were declared unconstitutional. The idea of a minimum wage, and you ask yourself, where in the Constitution does it give the federal government the power to regulate wages? Commerce Clause. Over the 30 or 40 years in the early 1900s, Congress pretty much got its way. Every time there is a decision made by the Supreme Court, chances were Congress won, and Congress's power expanded, or the federal government's power expanded, thanks to the Commerce Clause. Over time, what we saw in the 60s, especially in 70s, 80s, and 90s, is the federal grant program. And what Congress decided to do is they said, hey, we are going to give the states money. We're going to give them a grant. And in exchange, the states are going to use that money to fulfill a national issue or to address a national issue. So Congress collects the money and then hands it out to the states. There's different names for this and different time periods. We have revenue sharing, cooperative federalism, fiscal federalism. But what Congress did is they attached strings to these grants. They just didn't say, here, states, here's money, do whatever you want with it. They didn't do that. They attached conditions. They said, if you want this money, you will do this for us. A lot of the times, especially early on, the grants were for land. The Morrill Act gave federal land to the states, and then in exchange, the states sold that land and set up colleges. Let's move on to the idea of contemporary federalism. In the 1960s and 70s, we know there's a lot of movements, the civil rights movement and the war on crime, the environment. With all of these, the federal government was involved. In 1964, with the Civil Rights Act, the federal government said, schools, states, you will not get this money. You will not get money for education if you don't desegregate. So that's a big stick that the federal government was using to get their way. That, you don't want to do what we say, we're not going to give you money. In the 60s, Congress started offering what we call block grants. What that was is it's a large chunk of money. It's a block of money, not literally, but it's a block of money. And the federal government said, help out with, we can say poverty. And so they got a lot of money, a big chunk of money for a general purpose. And the federal government said, do what you want. Fix this issue how you see fit. And in the 1970s, with Nixon, there were mega grants where the federal government said, here's a huge chunk of money. Now, fix some of society's needs, address some of these issues. They were not specific conditions. And so states had a lot of power to determine what to do with this money. Well, the federal government, in just a couple minutes, we'll find out that the federal government didn't like just giving away this money and not getting anything in return. And so we are going to see the federal government start attaching strings again. But first, let's look at the idea of a marble cake federalism. And that's what we are seeing here. Think about a marble cake, how the vanilla cake and the chocolate cake, they're intermingled. They have, it's not blended and you don't get one murky looking cake. They're just intertwined with each other. And this whole idea of federalism is gone, where we think that there's a federal government and here's what the federal government can do and here's what the states can do, and it's a clear separation. That's not what we see, or that's not what we have anymore. I say it's a hodgepodge where the different governments have overlapping authority, where the federal government gets involved with state issues and the states help out the federal government with some of their issues. And like I said, with the ideas of block grants, Congress started getting away from them because the states could do what they want. There was less control by the federal government. And so, like I said, they had strings attached. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan started returning power back to the states. Reagan had the idea to cut the influence, to reduce the influence of the federal government. And we call this new federalism because it's trying to go back to the way it was. In The 1980s, states were reliant on grants, and with some of these grants, there were still strings attached. There is a court case in which South Dakota sued the federal government, and South Dakota said, you can't attach all these strings, all these conditions to these grants. Well, the Supreme Court said, no, South Dakota, you're wrong. The federal government did have the power to attach conditions to these grants. And if you don't want to do these things that the federal government says, don't take the money. And there is a case, this case was about the drinking age. The federal government said, hey, if you want all this money for transportation, you're going to raise the drinking age to 21. Do you know that the drinking age is not a federal law? Each state has set the drinking age to 21 because the federal government said, we're not going to give you any money for highways if you don't raise the drinking age. That's what I'm talking about when I say these strings are attached. With these strings, like I said, states get money in exchange for following some rules or addressing some issues. We can call these mandates as well. And the last thing is the idea of devolution. And with this idea, this started in the 1990s. And the push, it was a conservative push to start reducing, again, the federal government's powers. Give it back to the states. Let the states have the authority to do these things. So conservatives wanted to reduce the scope of the federal government. And so we call this time period devolution. As you can see, the whole idea of federalism has changed over the years. In the early part of American history, states had a lot of power, and the federal government was relatively small in size. And that was the way all the way up until the Industrial Revolution. And then as things changed, Congress started getting more involved, or the federal government started getting more involved with ideas, with things, and they used their implied powers. They relied on the Commerce Clause, the Interstate Commerce Clause, and then the idea of the Necessary and Proper Clause to address a whole host of issues. In the 60s and 70s, there was a big push for grants, and the federal government got more involved. They said, you want this money? Do what we say. And so that's how the federal government got involved in areas that really there's no justification for them getting involved. There's nowhere in the Constitution that says the federal government has that power to do it. But they have the states do it for them by giving them money. In the 80s and 90s, there's a push to kind of have the federal government back off a little bit. We call this new federalism. And then in the 90s, the devolution, to reduce the size of the federal government, to have the states, to return authority back to the states. Federalism can be tricky. And hopefully this section, this unit, helps you understand the relationship that states have with the federal government and how it's changed over the course of the last 200 and plus years. Until next time, have a good day.